Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Great to see so many of you coming online and joining us for this webinar on rail reform. Great to have so many of you spending a bit of your lunchtime with us. Hopefully you've all managed to get a cup of tea and a sandwich to go with it. And we're looking forward to a really good session. It's a really important topic, probably the most important topic for the railways this year, that apart from driving forward growth in rail freight, which is of course number one. So whilst attendees are still joining us, let me just do a bit of housekeeping. I think I know most of you who are joining, but for those of you who don't know me, I'm Maggie Simpson, Director General of the Rail Freight Group. Yvonne Mulder, my colleague, is online also, and if you've got any technical questions, do pop them through to Yvonne and she'll help you if you can. For those of you who have got a burning question that you want to ask, you can do so using the Q&A function, which you should be able to see in front of you. We've got plenty of time today for discussion and questions, so please do keep your questions coming through. We'll try and get through as many of those as we can. We are recording the webinar and we'll hope to have that posted up later in the week, just once we've got it checked over. So if you do need to pop away for a moment, then you can look back on that recording after the event. And I think, unless anybody tells me otherwise, we'll be able to circulate copies of the slides if you want them. So do let us know if you do that. This is the first webinar on rail reform. I'm not expecting it to be the last, because I think, as we'll see when we get into the discussions, it will be, you know, a big topic that consumes a lot of thought over the coming months. But it's really great that we've been able to hold this webinar today, which is really very early in the programme. And a huge thank you to Ed and Charlotte for giving us their time today, and also for being prepared to do that so early in the programme. What I would say is, I think, you know, my experience so far is that there are a lot of questions still being worked through here. So I ask your patience in those questions and answers, that, you know, there's a lot still to work out, but please keep the questions coming. We'll get through as many as we can, and hopefully if they can't be answered today, the answers will come up at some point in the not too distant future. So I think there's still some people making their sandwiches and their tea and joining us, but we've got a good number of people over the line now, so let's get started, I think. So I'm delighted to welcome our first speaker today, Charlotte Clark, I'm going to read your title in full, Charlotte, Deputy Director, Rail Transformation Programme, there we go, at the Department for Transport. So amongst other roles, Charlotte's leading the programme to deliver the new legislation for reform, and also has all the principal freight work streams reporting into her. So Charlotte, thank you very much for coming on today, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Maggie. That's really good. So I don't need to do my introduction. You've done it for me. Thank you. Right, bear with me, everybody. I'm just going to try and share my screen now, which worked 2 minutes ago when we trialed it out. Let's see if it still works. So, and slideshow. So, can everybody see this? Now, I can't see you now, but can you all see this?
It's perfect. Spot on.
Perfect. Brilliant. So, really, so the purpose of this session today, what we wanted to do is give you a really high-level overview of the Williams-Shapps plan for rail, talk to you a little bit about what this means for the freight industry and the opportunities, and then talk to you a little bit more about the sort of transformation journey. So as Maggie said, this is very much the start of the journey, and you know, the white paper sets out the principles for, you know, the vision that we've got for the railways in the future, but there is an awful lot of detail that we still need to work through, an awful lot of work we need to do in terms of engaging with the sector, consulting, developing the legislation. So very much the sort of start of the journey, but we wanted to sort of give you a sort of a run through today of sort of what's in the white paper. So a little bit of background, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, but the Williams Rail Review, of course, was led by Cleith Williams, and it was launched back in 2018 following the timetabling disaster that year, which I think really sort of brought to bear sort of the reality that actually it was very difficult to pinpoint where had the problems occurred, who was to blame, and I think it really exposed that sort of lack of, you know, accountability and leadership in the rail sector. So Keith looked at a full range of different options to sort of come up with the solutions that he presented in the plan for rail. He did extensive research with passengers, with freight customers and operators to look at sort of the needs of different groups. and to understand sort of trust in rail. So he did focus groups across regions. So it was not just about looking at the structures. He was looking at, what does this mean for all types of users of the railways, to really try and identify the key problems. And all the review findings that came out from Keith's review, they have fundamentally underpinned the Williams-Shapps plan for rail, which was published last month. But the central message and the review was that we really need urgent and radical change to help the railways become more customer focused, and that's customers in terms of rail passengers, but also freight customers, and financially sustainable, so it's working in the national interest as a public service. So in broad terms, the Williams review and Keith's work identified 6 key problems with the railways as they stand now. One, that the railway too often loses sight of its customers, both passengers and freight. Number 2, it's missing opportunities to meet the needs of the communities it serves. 3, it's fragmented and accountabilities are not always very clear. 4, the sector is lacking strategic direction, so we don't have a sort of long-term strategic vision for the railways. 5, we need to tackle productivity and long-term costs, so the railways are as efficient as possible. And 6, that the sector often struggles to innovate and adapt. So that was sort of background to the rail review. I won't talk too much through this slide, but it's just really a bit of a journey. So we started in May 2018 with the timetabling crisis, and the review kicked off later that year. So in terms of underpinning Keith's work, he visited 200 stakeholders. The call for evidence, we had over 750 responses. And in 2019 we published the evidence papers. Then we've had COVID, so that delayed the publication a little bit, because what we wanted to do was make sure that the recommendations still stood true in light of the pandemic. And we published last month, and we're sort of now here on the journey, but the sort of future is we continue to need to engage with you as we design and deliver the reforms. Again, I won't go through this slide in huge amounts of detail, but effectively the white paper itself is set out in 8 chapters. So we talk about what's happened since privatisation. We reassert government's commitment to the railway and investing in the railway. We set out the proposals around the single guiding mind to the creation of Great British Railways. We talk about the replacement for franchising, how we want to deliver better passenger services, the role of the private sector, which is going to be critically important. I'm sure really interesting to you in terms of how we sort of unleash the private sector's potential in terms of the railways. How can we accelerate innovation and modernisation? And then sort of finally the sort of fun chapters around how do we empower rails people? So what do we do to upskill, support and diversify the workforce? So those are sort of the eight chapters that make up the white paper. So as we go through the white paper, there are 10 key outcomes which underpin the white paper as a whole and the plan for rail. So it's probably worth me just going through these. I'll go through sort of fairly rapidly. But first is around modernising the passenger experience. So this is about about delivering high quality and consistent services. We want accessible, reliable journeys, in making sure that we have modal connections with other transport services. So things that we've got in the white paper include the accessibility audit and strategy. So how do we make sure that information is better for passengers and users? They know how they can access the railway and have good journeys, high quality journeys. So in terms of the simple industry structure, so you'll see in the white paper we've set out that we will bring in track and train together in Great British Railways. So they will act as a guiding mind for the system, with single national leadership and a new brand and identity. So Great British Railways will be responsible for running and planning the network. So they will own the infrastructure and collect most of the fare revenue. They will procure passenger services and set the timetable, most of the fares and timetables, and they'll be made up of regional divisions that are rooted locally with accountability, really focused on sort of meeting local needs. And we're going to have a 30-year strategy for the railways. As I say, I've mentioned there that you'll have spotted in the white paper that Andrew Haynes has been asked to look at how do we establish some interim arrangements, drawing on the expertise from across the industry, so that we can start to build the interim capability as we move up to move into GBR. And I know Ed will say a little bit more about that in his presentation in a few minutes. In terms of the sort of third outcome on retail revolution, so we want a clearer customer offer with clearer prices, really easy to understand information, simpler travel information, contactless payments, and things around sort of compensation, making it easier for people to claim when things go wrong. So just making it, as a customer, again, as easy as possible to use the rail system. In terms of number 4, new ways of working with the private sector. So you've seen through the white paper, we really reaffirm, the important role that the private sector is going to play in the railways and will continue to play in the railways. So, we know that private sector innovation has unlocked massive growth since privatisation. We want to continue to harness that, and we want to grow and develop the opportunities for private sector involvement in the railways. So in terms of passenger services, we've got the new contracts, the passenger service contracts, which will be replacing franchising, and they will be really, really strongly focused on reliability, performance and efficiency. And we anticipate that the first sort of competition for the passenger service contracts will be by late 2022. But more broadly, we really want to support new opportunities for innovators and suppliers, so both small local partners, so in the supply chain, through streamlined contracts and more contestability in the rail system. Okay, so number 5, new offer for freight. So the white paper sort of sets out that we'll have national coordination. So we want greater opportunities for growth and really strong safeguards to put rail freight on the front foot. And we think that the opportunities that we set out in the white paper, this is good news for the freight industry. Real commitment to support the freight industry to grow and prosper. Number 6, in terms of the outcomes around greater control for local people in their places. So I talked a few minutes ago about the sort of, in terms of under GBR, we'll have the regional divisions. So again, this is about making sure that those regional divisions are engaging locally, so that actually the railways are responsive to local communities and supporting local improvements, and and they're accountable to local people in the places they serve. We're up to 6, increased efficiency and speed of delivery enhancements. So the white paper sets out sort of commitment to restoring lost links, and the real opportunities that we think that rail brings in terms of economic growth, and particularly in terms of thinking about economic recovery. In terms of the workforce, we really want to sort of diversify and invest in the workforce, so enhancing skills, new opportunities for people working on the railways, and thinking about how do we create high value jobs, thinking about the use of data and technology. And in cleaner and greener railways, so number 9, so in terms of the outcomes set out in the white paper, we think that railways can really spearhead the nation's ambitions around becoming a world leader in cleaner and greener transport. So there's a commitment in there for an environment plan in 2022, and you'll see there's a longer term commitment in there. Sorry, typo here from me, it's 2040 in terms of the ambition to remove diesel only trains from the network. But we think the railway, freight has huge opportunity to play a part of this in terms of the ambitions around the environmental agenda. And finally, in terms of the outcomes, and I've touched on this a moment ago, is around economic recovery and financially sustainable railways. So the railways are a public service, they're paid for by taxpayers, but we think that there are huge opportunities. We know there are huge opportunities in the way that actually the railways connect people and places and foster economic growth. And by bringing together the responsibility for the costs and revenue of the railways in Great British Railways, we think this will support the railways to become more financially sustainable. So what does this mean for freight? So real message for us from the white paper is that actually simplification is more important than nationalisation. So we've had lots of questions about, does this mean we're nationalising the railways? No, this is not about nationalisation. It's about simplifying the railways. At the moment we've got dozens of different organisations. I think we probably all see where there's, there are sometimes silo workings, and your individual priorities mean that we're not always working towards the same goals and outcomes. So, this is really about, fundamentally about sort of simplifying the existing structures and simplifying the accountability. So, I mentioned before, we absolutely want to keep the best elements of the private sector that have helped us to deliver growth. The private sector has played a major role in terms of the growth of the railways. Freight is already a nimble and largely private sector market and will remain so. We want these reforms to help freight to continue to grow and thrive. So in terms of kind of, what we set out in the white paper for freight, I won't go through in all detail, but, we've committed in there to, critical safeguards. We want freight to make sure freight operators have fair access to the railways. We've committed to a new rules-based track access regime, which will be underpinned by legislation that, it won't be set in stone. We need it to be able to adapt and change. But what we've committed to, that it won't be, Great British Railways will not be able to just unilaterally change those, change the sort of track access regime. But what we want to do with you as we're sort of developing these reforms is work in partnership with the market, with stakeholders, to think about how we, how we develop a new access framework as we move forward. There will continue to be protections in place for freight operators. So the ORR in the future will act as an appeals body for operators. So their role will be to make sure that Great British Railways is applying the policies on track access and charging fairly. We will be giving a statutory duty to Great British Railways to promote rail freight, and I think Ed will probably say a little bit more about that in a few minutes, because we know that that can secure economic and environmental benefits. We are also going to have a national freight coordination team within Great British Railways. So, I think some of what we've heard is, it can be difficult for freight operators, if you've not got a single point of contact. So we want to make sure that you've got that single point of contact in the rail body, the new rail body, to kind of support your work, and that will really help embed, the sort of strategic thinking, particularly within the new 30-year strategy. So we've got the whole industry strategic plan, which is going to be a 30-year vision for the railways, which I think is really important in terms of sort of underpinning this. And in terms of things like future access agreements, we think there's real opportunities to support the growth of rail freight by, through more flexible use of train paths, simpler charging, thinking about the incentives. So there's lots we want to do there and sort of explore with you as we develop the sort of reform plans and implementation. So last slide from me before I hand over to Ed. So I've given you a sort of bit of a summary there of, what's the totality of the white paper at a fairly high level. As I say, still a huge amount to work through in terms of the detail of this. But what we are sort of in the process of doing now is, so I sit in the Rail Transformation Programme in the Department for Transport. So the programme is being set up with the department jointly with the rail industry, and the sort of key priorities in the coming months is making sure that we have a common vision and understanding of the vision for the railways. We need to start setting out the phases of delivery. So there's a huge amount to deliver in that white paper. We now need to sort of work out, okay, how and when do things get delivered? Some things in the white paper can happen fairly quickly. So, the commitment, you've seen the sort of commitment in the white paper to flexi season tickets. That was something that was able to happen quite quickly. That's happened this week. Other things will take longer because they need to be underpinned by legislation. So what we need to do now is work out the phasing of how we deliver this reform programme, and work collectively with the sector to look at how we design and implement projects. So Keith Williams is still very much going to be involved in this. So he continues to have an interest, he's absolutely keen to stay close to this and sort of support the reform programme and transformation programme. So we're going to be setting up an advisory group to support the Secretary of State, and Keith Williams has been asked to chair that. So that's still at the early stage. That group isn't in place yet, but actually we're thinking about the terms of reference for that group and the membership. And as I mentioned earlier, and again, Ed will touch on this in a few minutes, Andrew Haynes, who's you will know is the current Chief Executive of Network Rail, Secretary of State has asked him to start developing plans for the interim arrangements, so working with others in the industry. So again, thinking about how do we move from where we are now to the end state. There's a process we need to evolve over time as we develop these reforms. So in terms of DFT's responsibilities, we are leading the policy development, including any legislation that's going to be needed to deliver the reforms set out in the plan. So the Reform and Delivery Access Team, which I don't know if my colleague Peter is online yet, but hopefully he's joined us. So his team in the Rail Transformation Programme is leading policy development in relation to rail freight and access reform, charging incentives, and ORR reform. So we are working really closely with our colleagues, ORR, as well as the Department for Transport business as usual teams, including freight. And we want to engage with stakeholders, users throughout the policy development process. We're expecting to consult further on reforms more formally through a sort of public consultation later this year, but there'll be lots of sort of informal consultation that happens before we get to that process, before we get to that stage where we were wanting to test things. So if Maggie's happy, I mean, from our perspective, we'd really welcome the opportunity to share further updates with you in the coming months as we're sort of developing policy proposals and sort of keep you in the loop. So I hope this will be the first of many times that we get to come speak to you. Right, I've rattled through a little bit there, but am I handing over to Ed at this point?
Oh, that was brilliant. Thank you. And yes, absolutely. You know, we take that as books that, you know, at any point that you want to come and talk to members, we're happy to facilitate either through a format like this or roundtables or one-to-one or whatever's needed. I think, you know, you have our commitment on that. Let us move over now next then to Ed. I've got Ed's title here, Programme Director Freight Reforms, and Ed at the moment is sitting within Network Rail Strategic Policy Unit, or Interim Guiding Mind to be, I think is probably how you describe it, but no doubt Ed can tell us more about that. So Ed, thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you, Charlotte, and thanks everybody for taking the time out of your day jobs today to listen to us update you on where we've been. Yeah, I mean, in terms of strategic policy unit, I think, you know, that is a project team that sits within Andrew's office. It will soon change its name, I would expect, to something along the lines of Great British Railways Transition Team. I know Maggie has said that that's the interim guiding mind, but just to be precise, the interim guiding mind doesn't exist yet. It will do at some point in the future, and the team that I sit within is a project team, understanding what that might look like in the future. So just to clarify there. So in terms of the changes that Charlotte outlined, just to recap very briefly, there'll be no sudden changes. From a structural perspective, you know, these proposals take a high degree of consultation and, of course, legislation, and so the formal structures won't exist or are not anticipated before 2023. But in the meantime, Andrew Haynes has been asked to lead the development of plans for what an interim guiding mind should look like or may look like in the interim period. And this is very benefits focused. So all of the things that we can achieve are not just purely down to legislative changes, of course. So the project team that he's set up is focusing on a number of benefits. Within that team, I lead for freight. And the proposals that we are developing at the moment will be presented by Andrew to Secretary of State in expected late July, early August. These are also things subject to change, of course. And I've said here that we expect to go live in autumn, but these are all subject to green light from government. So everything that I'm talking about over the next few moments and through the slides is very work in progress, and our ideas at the moment really about how an interim guiding mind could support freight. So in terms of the overall programme, we see a number of phases throughout, right to the end. We're currently, of course, in phase one, where we are currently thinking about what does the design look like in terms of an interim guiding mind? What's the high level sector target operating model? And once the interim body goes live at, say, the autumn period, we'll enter into a period of phase two where there are interim or shadow arrangements, etc. And the capabilities of GBR will develop over time, ultimately to a phase three there, where the full duties, powers and functions will be granted, and there'll be a further iteration and phasing in of the transformation programme overall. So I want to talk a little bit about the opportunity that we've got with reform, with the wider sector and policy at the moment. And I like to think about our opportunity in a Venn diagram. We have net zero policy imperative from government at the moment, where rail freight can play such an important part in that story of modal shift. And we also have at the moment reduced passenger demand, which is difficult for the overall railway finances, and we need to see passengers return. We absolutely do. But that reduced demand presents us with an opportunity as well. We also see rail reform, and this is where we have the bonnet up on the industry's procedures and its processes. And as a project team, our vision is pretty clear for freight. We want GBR to enable a growing and sustainable rail logistics offering, where customers, many of you are on today, are placed at the heart of our endeavour, where we're constantly focusing on innovating and being better, where we provide an agile and creative approach to growth. We've got some quite ambitious growth forecasts that describe a forecast of over the next 10 to 15 years, a doubling of the rail freight volumes. And we want to enable that. But we're only going to do that if we work closely together and move at pace to ensure that those growth ambitions are realised and that our environmental credentials remain current, remain relevant, and above all, why our customers, many of you, choose rail and continue to do so. So the question that I am trying to answer as part of this reform programme is, how can the interim guiding mind, how can the interim Great British Railways enable that? So freight in the interim guiding mind, we would want to see it provide leadership and set the strategic direction for the sector to grow our market share and meet the industry commitments. The creation of a freight directorate in the interim guiding mind, we want to see that as a single point of accountability across the public institutions for developing rail freight. Some of you may think that we have a single freight team within Network Rail. We don't. We have 4. We have one that's focused on property. We have one that's focused on account management, project management, and delivery oversight. We have a strategic planning team for freight, and we have a train planning team for freight, all separate teams. And we also have separate and different teams, multiple teams in DFT and other institutions as well. Now, that's quite fragmented, and I have a vision here that we have an opportunity to create a freight coordination team that has line of sight from long-term strategy all the way through to enabling growth through market development plans, its property strategy and plans, its R&D focus, right through to train planning and delivery, and all that line of sight the way through to the sale of a path and the rights that go with it. I think that's really, really, really important if we're going to achieve the ambitious growth targets that we've got, and we need to have a strong central function for freight into the future. The culture and capability of this team is going to be absolutely critical. And I used a phrase recently that of the ethos of the logistician, and I want this team to be able to speak the language of the logistics and transport sector rather than necessarily the railway. It will need to do both, of course, but we do need to have a cultural shift so that the institution of Great British Railways is truly customer focused. And if it is to do that, it needs to speak in the right way to its customers. In terms of the project or the programme that I lead, we have a number of different work streams, some of which have been started off in Network Rail already, with the development of the freight strategy that many of you have been involved with and sit on the programme board indeed to develop. And that really sets our vision for the future. Talks about our different roles and responsibilities with rail freight growth and delivering decarbonisation. At the bottom here, you'll see a number of tactical work streams that I've described that deliver that strategy. What I would say here is that some are more important than others, and some are more important than others now, and some come later. I'll come on to those in a bit more detail. So in terms of our current thinking, these are just ideas at the moment. I really want the freight directorate within any interim guiding mind to be ambitious. And we would want to see, subject to approvals, market development plans and creating a centre of rail freight advice for new to rail businesses. We want to see a new property and land use strategy plan developed within the first year or so, and we would want to work on what incentives we need to have to encourage modal shift. Every supply chain is different. Every supply chain has its different challenges and has its different needs in terms of encouraging modal shift. A one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to incentives, and they are quite wide in context, by the way. We need to meet that and be quite agile in the way that we encourage growth and modal shift. The way in which publicly funded R&D is managed and structured at the moment ought to see some significant improvement, and I'd love to see a dedicated fund and delivery strategy made available for any freight directorate in an interim guiding mind. Of course, this is a programme of massive change over the next few years, and so this team, if it is to be created, will have a strong change management approach to it and ensure that the access and charging policies that are developed in the future are catering for freight in the right way to deliver our vision and our objectives. And into the future, I would expect this team to be developing the future commercial offer when that time comes. So hopefully that's a bit of a flavour of our ideas, our current thinking, and hopefully that will prompt some good debate and discussion about how you see a role for the interim guiding mind and freight. Thanks very much.
Ed, thank you very much. That's brilliant. So we've got one or two questions coming in. People do get your questions in. Now is your opportunity to ask them. Charlotte, I've got Celine on twice. I assume one of them is Peter.
Yes, Peter is there. Peter has told me he's definitely there.
Right. Fine. So
Don't know which one.
Both Celine and Peter to panelist, and then we've got them both.
Perfect.
There we go. This should now work.
Celine's definitely on holiday, but Peter is definitely with us.
Well, whoever's on as the other Celine, then hopefully we've got you there. Cool. Look at that. The system works, sort of. Brilliant. Good stuff. Okay, folks, start bringing your questions in. Let me just start with a couple, if I might. Charlotte, can you outline for us the sort of legislative programme timescales and what it is that government's looking to achieve by way of sort of primary and or secondary legislation in that programme?
Yeah, I will, and absolutely, and I may well bring, that's definitely not Celine, that is Peter, I may well bring Peter in.
Yeah.
So in terms of, as I set out at the start, we've got the white paper, there's clearly a huge amount of detail and we need to work through in terms of deciding what needs to go into legislation, and we need to consult on that. So the timeline at the moment is we are not anticipating a bill probably before the end of about 2022. And I think that, that reflects the amount of work that we think needs to be done in terms of leading up to the bill, both in terms of engagement with with stakeholders. And I think somebody asked the question earlier about in the bar about what do we mean by stakeholders. I mean that in its broadest sense, and we'll be looking to organisations such as us, as RFG, AREA, and others who can help us reach the people we need to, who are going to be impacted by reforms. But in terms of legislative programme, we haven't decided yet exactly what the balance will be between sort of primary and secondary legislation, and I think that's something we need to work through. Peter, do you want to come in and say a little bit more about it, because you've been leading on much of the legislative work as well? You've been thinking about some of this.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, as Charlotte has said, there's a huge amount for us to do. So we can expect a sort of formal consultation to be published probably around autumn of this year. But I think the key thing to note about that is that these formal consultations tend to last for about 12 weeks. That is not the start and the end of the consultation process. That process will carry on almost right up until I think we get introduced into the House. So we will carry on talking to the industry, talking to yourselves about what this will all look like going forward, and in particular on things like access. In terms of the legislation itself, I think it'll probably take about a year to get through Parliament. These kinds of bills do, and especially, I mean, who knows what it's going to be like in a year's time in terms of remote working, etc. I mean, we just don't know, but there is a bit of a backlog in Parliament at the moment, so we're having to in terms of legislation which still hasn't finished yet. So we'll be we'll be looking for a slot which fits in around to take account of that. So as I say, sometime in the autumn. So yeah, and then it's not just about new legislation as well, but what we do with existing legislation. There's a huge amount which is already sitting on the statute book, and it might and we honestly do not know at the moment, but it might be how do we amend existing legislation. So we need to also consider that as well.
Yeah. But as Peter said, it would be an initiative process. So we will have a sort of formal government public consultation, which will probably happen this autumn. But then there's a process, once you get the sort of consultation back, is this sort of continue to iterate sort of policy proposals right up to the point that we introduce a bill.
Yeah. Thank you. That's really helpful, because I think, one of the things that, I know I've raised with you also, is about the sort of the various levels of commitments, protections and such like that exist in the extant body of law, some of which is no longer relevant, some of which needs changing, and some of which is stupidly highly relevant. And, it's about what we write, but it's also about what we cross out, and making sure that we've got time to consider both. I've started reading some of the existing law, but it's a long job, as I'm sure you'll have found. So
it definitely is
an interesting one. Ed, let me just turn to you. You spoke about the future commercial offer. In that sense, I suspect you mean the sort of access charging total package that GBR will offer to the freight industry, rather than the commercial offer that would exist between a FOC and its customers. Am I right?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Good point, Maggie. So yes, so in terms of the commercial offer there, that is precisely what GBR will offer to access beneficiaries generally, and not just on the operating side either, but particularly from as we go on the property side as well.
And can you say anything, at this stage? Now you've touched on sort of reform of access and charging, but sort of what's going to happen next on that?
So much of the work that is underway generally happens with the Department of Transport. The work that we are currently underway with is ensuring that our kind of strategic aims and ambitions are embedded within all of the policies and the processes that are being thought about initially at the moment from the legislative perspective. So as I said earlier on, we developed earlier in the year together the freight strategy. So right from the outset, ensuring that the principles that we have talked about collectively within that strategy feature right the way through all of the procedures and the policies and the legislation that we're developing. So as a principle.
Yeah, thank you. And Peter, did you want? I know your team are looking at some of these work streams. Can you add anything on that about ambition or timescales for charges and for access reform?
So again, we'll be looking for a consultation to come out on that in the autumn. I think the key thing for us is to make sure that as we design the legislative framework for access and charging, it enables Ed's team and Great British Railways to have that freedom, that flexibility to absolutely be the guiding mind for the railway to be able to deliver the growth targets that there are going to be for rail freight. I think that's the key thing for us, and one of the things we will be sort of consulting on is what that legislative framework looks like.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let me turn to some of the questions that are coming in. Charlotte, I think you've answered this one. How do you define stakeholders that you'll speak to? A large number of suppliers, and absolutely the supply base is critical, I think, particularly around that private investment point. So, if I'm not sure who's asked the question, if you are an RFG member, then you've already heard the commitment to come back and talk in future, and we will definitely be doing that and feeding in views. If you are a member of another organisation, I'm quite sure that approach will be shared across those other bodies as well. But do come back to us if you want some more on that. Question here from Bill Free. Ed has described the 4 ways that NR currently deal with the rail freight industry. There is a 5th, the hire of infrastructure trains. I don't know whether there's any comment you got on that, Ed, whether there's any expectation that will change.
No, not that is within my remit or area. So.
Okay, so I think that's an area one that perhaps is one for GBR to get stuck into. Is your expectation, perhaps this is a question we should have asked generally, but it just comes to mind, the relationship, I think, between that freight team who's in the centre of GBR and those regional bodies, is there any thoughts yet on how that plays out? Because I'm assuming, in that example, that the hire of engineering trains could be done in the centre, but most likely could be done out in the regions. But how's that relationship going to work?
So in terms of generally, so that the freight coordination team that will sit centrally will have accountabilities and activities that are very appropriate at the central level. So account management, train planning for strategic freight services. And so all of those things, strategy-wise and train planning, will happen centrally for freight. The regional structure, the new bodies, kind of in a regional sense, need to deliver the services, and it is absolutely one of our critical design thinking about how each regional body is got the right accountabilities for freight, and the real key thing about this is that they are positive incentives for these regional structures, so that they really want to adopt the strategies and that they want to grow rail freight. It's not a punishment, if you like. it's positive, and they will have the right accountabilities, and we are developing those at the moment. Now, they will, how that manifests itself into resourcing, etc., unknown at the moment. But first and foremost, they need to be incentivized in the right way, and a lot of that is going to flow from the growth targets that are being or will be developed for the rail freight sector as a whole. So everything, I see the rail freight growth targets as our industry North Star, this thing that we will aim to deliver year upon year as a sector, and that will need to be fed into the regional structures to deliver the train service. Yeah,
thanks, and I completely support that. The regional bodies are going to have a lot on their hands, not least the passenger fare box, and making sure we've got the strong accountabilities in place is going to be critical. Okay, a question here about capacity on the network. How does the new structure see freight path capacity going forward? How will the network be capable of accommodating growth? And if it's not all in place, how are we going to get it?
One for me, I think. So in terms of GBR in the future, ultimately, we have a structure at the moment that is unable to make decisions in one place. The decisions are made in multiple areas, and this really comes to the crux of the reform, really. And, you know, we have examples right the way around the country where we have passenger services running around with only a few people on it that are in the way of freight services that could be, taking a lot of lorries off the road. And so the public benefit is so much more. But the way in which the decisions in the current structure are taken is that it's not easy. You can't easily make those decisions and change them because the way the franchise model works, etc., etc. The creation of GBR brings a lot of the decision making into one place, and so where it is right in the public interest to make those choices like I've just described, it will be able to do so in a far more streamlined and effective way. Structurally, we should see from that a much more efficient way of utilizing the network, and that will only be good for freight where we have those issues.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think there's a lot to work out, I think, in this space. I mean, my nervousness is, when we talk about a lightly used passenger train and a heavily laden freight train, then perhaps the question answers itself. It's when we've got, a new HS2 train and an existing freight train that somebody sent £3 million on some wagons for, and where that value is closely matched. I think, the rules that apply in that space are going to be the more complicated part of the mix to get right, I suspect.
Yeah, the precise decision criteria is very, very critical. Yes.
Tricky. Okay, let us carry on. There's some more questions coming in. Pointed one here. I think, I don't know whether this is you, Charlotte, but perhaps from the government answer at least. In reality, will Network Rail just become GBR? So will a lot of the current practices get carried over with a different name? What's government's ambition in that space?
So the ambition is absolutely not. I think we try to be really clear in the white paper, recognition that what we need is a new organisation with a new culture and a different sort of set of skills. So, NR is an engineering infrastructure organisation. GBR needs to be able to operate commercially. It needs to be able to behave commercially. So actually, it is going to require to be a different sort of organisation. So in terms of this sort of GBR, the NR, sort of the infrastructure will all come under that, but it will be a new organisation, and we were looking to develop that and bring in different sets of expertise and skills into that. So I think the fact that Andrew Haynes has been asked to look at thinking about the interim arrangements shouldn't be taken as a sign of this is sort of rebranding of NR. This will be a new organisation.
Okay. Yeah, I think we all hear the ambition. So let's hope there's some we keep the good bits and move on from the less good bits. Okay, what have we got? How does the guiding, I think we've partly answered this one, but let me read it out and see if there's any more thoughts coming in. The guiding mind approach access over congested infrastructure. What are the implications of more flexible access rights for freight? Could it make it more difficult for freight to give customers assurance? I think we've sort of touched on that. And then the question, is ORR the arbiter if decisions are challenged? So what do we know so far about the new role of the ORR?
So do you want me to take that one, Charlotte? So absolutely. So the ORR has this role at the moment in terms of access, and the white paper, it sets out that the access regime will be underpinned by legislation, and there will be what it calls critical safeguards in there for rail freight. But we also talk about the ORR's role changing, though it will still have an appeals role in relation to access. But the key for us is working out how that fits with having a guide in mind in terms of GBR that can have the freedom to take decisions in terms of access. So what we're trying to do at the moment in talking to the ORR and Network Rail is to look at what do we actually need from the role of the ORR? What protections do the freight operators, the open access operators need in relation to ORR, and how do we ensure that is within the legislative framework? Because it's pretty clear that what it says in the white paper, that you know, GBR will not be able to change, you know, certain parts of the access regime. It will be in legislation. So we're considering at the moment, how do we put those ORR processes, you know, what do we do with those? Do we put them in legislation? Do we put them in guidance? And that's something, Maggie, that we'll be coming out to speak to you and your members about, and sort of testing some ideas about how that might work and what your members would want to see. What's the minimum kind of thing they would want to see in respect of those ORR processes?
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I mean, I think I've had some members who've interpreted it as the ORR retains its existing role in access, and clearly that isn't the case. So we need to work out what it is and what it is that's necessary to underpin ongoing investment, I think is the bit that we've really got to get our heads around. Yeah. Okay, question, how will all this work in Scotland? So the relationship between GBR and Transport Scotland. And then a second part of that, what happens to the rail delivery group work, including the rail supply group? So two parts to that, really. Relationship with Scotland first.
Yeah, I'm happy to come here, and it may be that Ed wants to add to this. So in terms of, you know, we're very clear in the white paper that in terms of the existing devolved authorities, which would include in Scotland, they will continue to exercise their powers as they do now. So in terms of awarding contracts and setting fares, etc. So it will be as is now. But we want to work with Transport Scotland to think about, you know, how can we sort of help them benefit from what's happening in terms of more widely in terms of integration of track and train in GBR. In terms of, and did you want to say anything more about that from a freight perspective, Ed? Was there anything to add?
Yes, I think only to say generally across everything that we do in terms of the interaction between the different nations and regions, etc., that freight knows no boundaries, and so whatever we design here, you know, I think everyone on this call would recognise that freight doesn't need to see those boundaries.
Yeah. And in terms of rail delivery groups, so yeah, we set out in the white paper, so a number of the functions that currently sit in RDG will move across into GBR over time.
Yeah. Okay. And another question was asked about Wales, but I think you've touched on that, saying, you know, freight knows no boundaries, so we need to work for the best outcome in that space. Okay, responsibility for determining and funding freight enhancements, or indeed enhancements in general. Is this to be devolved to GBR, or is this still a process for DFT in effect? So where does RNEP sit? I think I paraphrased that question as.
Peter, do you know the answer to this one?
I'm afraid not. No, this one is not. It's not something which my team's thinking about. But we can certainly find out who in the transformation program is giving this some thought and come back to you on that, Maggie.
Yeah, that'd be well. Let's put it on the list of unanswered questions. That'd be great. It's quite possible that Treasury is sitting there thinking that the answer is, well, there won't be any anyway. But those are my words, not yours. So let's see. Okay, can Ed say something more about the rail terminals reference? And secondly, some emerging clues as to what the relationship with the subnational transport bodies is going to be and what their role might be in support of freight.
So in terms of terminals, I did mention at the end of my slides that we will be developing a new property and land use planning strategy. In that, we will also need to consider how the reference within the white paper on SRFIs will need to be factored into anything that GBR does in relation to supporting those developments and linking in with capacity, etc. going forward. So, I mean, in terms of any specifics, we haven't, the property and land use planning strategy hasn't started yet. It will start in the future, but that work hasn't started yet. But we will be engaging with everybody to make sure that whatever the strategy and plan looks like is right.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. I mean, I have observed Riley, and I think there's a lot that's good in William's chaps, but I noticed it had two references to railway land in the white paper. One was about using railway land to build houses on, and the other was about using railway land to support biodiversity. There didn't seem to be an awful lot about using railway land to actually run the railways, and so I think we need to you know, keep reminding people that GBR will be the freeholder of a significant proportion of the freight estate, and that therefore we need to enable that land to be used for the right purpose of growing rail freight, as long as, you know, obviously it's necessary for doing that. So that's certainly something I think where perhaps it's low down the list in some respects, but it's high up the list in others in terms of making sure that that stability is retained. A question about the promotion of rail freight. So what's our expectations, for example, around grants, track access discounts? Are there any sort of working examples of the kind of thing that we might expect to see in that space?
So I would say at the moment that that work has yet to commence. We in terms of what precisely that might look like. I think my reaction to that is really we need to ensure that whatever incentives we have and however they are brought about are reflective of the different supply chains that use the railways and are designed accordingly, because one size fits all doesn't work. Different supply chains, as I said, need different things and have different requirements from the railways and different challenges to achieve modal shift. So when we do come to developing or coming out to consultation to design these, we do need to be collectively reflective of those differing needs. And we want to have something that's pretty agile as well, I would say.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the last question that's just popped up in the chat. I'm going to paraphrase this. It's come from Andrew Harston, who spent a lot of his work, well, works for ABP now, spent a lot of his working career arguing about freight trains on the Felixstowe branch, and observes that the lightly used passengers train might well be lightly used, but it's still politically very important. So is there any more insight about how we're going to both assess the value of freight and passenger trains, but also tackle the political value associated with such decisions? Is the answer that DfT just give it to GBR and then it becomes remote from ministers, or is there wider thinking around how the access regime might influence this?
So in terms of the regime itself, I mean, I will come back to the fact that what we're trying to do is build this legislative framework that enables GBR to take those kinds of decisions. And I think, you know, the white paper is pretty clear that ministers will be expecting GBR to, you know, take access decisions to promote rail freight, and ministers will want to see that. So I think it's a matter of we'll be talking to Ed and colleagues about how we go about building that framework going forward.
And just to build on that slightly, you know, the work that's been undertaken recently by RDG with Deloitte on the value of rail freight, you know, that brings out some very important things for the sector in terms of assessing the wider socio-economic and customer value in rail freight, and we mustn't lose sight of that as we develop any decision criteria as GBR develops.
Brilliant. Okay, folks, it's 2 minutes to 2, so let us draw this to a conclusion. I think, you know, we could go on all day with questions because, as we said at the beginning, we're at the start of a discussion, the start of a programme, and inevitably that means there are still more questions and answers right across the programme. But a huge thank you, Charlotte, Ed and Peter, for being as honest with us as you can be around, you know, the state of the art in terms of the thinking, the programme that's ahead, the priorities and the framework with which this work will be taken forward. It's you know, it's encouraging to see that there's already so much structure and thinking around the question, and indeed that we you know, that we've got ways forward on some of the areas that have been running sores for some time, as well as some of the challenges that come with the reforms that have been cited. So thank you all very much for your time, and thank you to those of you who've joined us and for your questions today. As I said at the beginning, we'll hopefully have the the recording of this online later this week, subject just to some checks. We will circulate the slides unless Ed and Charlotte tell me that I can't. So drop us an email if you want them, and we'll get those across to you. And we will, of course, be keeping you updated with this work through our networks, and I'm sure through others as well, and hopefully come back with a future webinar at some point in the autumn as we get into the work and into the consultation phase. And I think it's fair to say that don't wait. If you've got a question, you know, drop me a note and we'll try and broker that and get some questions answered for you at any point during that work. So thank you all very much. It's 2 o'clock now, so we'll draw this to a conclusion. Enjoy your afternoon and hopefully see you all on another webinar again some point soon. Thank you very much all.